Thank you, Senator. Senator Nielsen.
Ms. Bosworth, thank you for coming today. And let me just follow on Senator Berryhill. We would very much appreciate it, and the people of California deserve it, to have a lot of time to review whatever the final product. Yesterday we had an unfortunate circumstance related to drought legislation that we got amendments the moment we got here in committee. You cannot analyze and give any true review, so that scrutiny is important. You mentioned the possible tax reform as a part of this. What kind of tax reform are you considering that would be needed to be incorporated into this cap?
Yeah, I mentioned tax reform just as, you know, there are many different options for dealing with the state's revenue volatility. Tax reform is something that's been discussed. We're not proposing that today. The governor's budget does include this enhanced rainy day fund as the way we would propose to deal with the state's revenue volatility. So we're not proposing any tax reform today.
I wanted to clarify it. That's all, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Nielsen. I have one more question following up on Senator Roth's concerns about the Prop 98 reserve. How would that reserve interact with whether we're in a Test 1, Test 2, or Test 3 year?
The short answer is that the reserve would not impact the calculation of the guarantee and whether it's a Test 1 or Test 2 or Test 3 year. And I'll actually turn it over to Nick Schweitzer to follow up on that.
Sure. So the Prop 98 guarantee calculation will be done every year the same as it's always done. And the reserve calculation would just be run to determine how much of that Prop 98 money, if any, should be put in reserve for allocation in future years. So there's no direct linkage between the two. Now, you know, there is sort of an implicit linkage in that, you know, the Proposition 98 formula itself is based on revenues, and it's designed to go up when revenues are good, and it's designed to go down when revenues are bad. And this reserve that we're trying to create are kind of designed to sort of do the opposite, to put some money aside when it's going up, and to allocate money out when the Prop 98 is going down. So when revenues are high, you tend to be in a Test 1 year, or you're paying off maintenance factor. Those would also likely be the years in which you're putting money in the reserve. In years in which you're going down, you're likely to be in a Test 3 year and creating maintenance factor, but that's also a point in time when you're likely to be taking money out of the reserve and allocating it out to schools on top of what 98 is providing.
So it sounds like they could work in unison, if not harmony, in that if we're in a Test 3, it's likely not a year we're going to be putting money into either the general reserve or the Prop 98 reserve.
Right.
Senator Roth.
If I could just follow up, and I'm not an expert on this, so please correct me, but the 98 reserve is formed by money that would otherwise be flowing to schools in any given year, right?
Correct. In years when high Prop 98 growth. When Prop 98 growth is in excess of what would be required to fund a growth in COLA.
So if that's the case, then why not let that money flow to the school districts? And if we're concerned about the reserve level in districts, are we not able to specify a higher reserve be maintained locally in the district coffers? And wouldn't that accomplish the same objective?
Well, I think from discussions we've had with school business officials, they tend to find it very difficult to plan for fluctuations in revenues coming down from the state. I think if we can smooth out our allocations to them, it's going to be easier for them to plan going forward and plan to have adequate reserves. Many feel that they need to hold extremely large reserves, well above 10%, 15 to 20%, because they're so uncertain as to what Sacramento is going to do to them every year, sort of thing.
Oh, not to belabor this, Mr. Chair, but if I...
Right ahead.
I mean, so if we're taking the money that would otherwise flow to a district and we're putting it in a fund up here for us to watch, why wouldn't we accomplish the same objective by sending it down to the districts? And if we don't like the reserve levels that are being maintained, specify a higher reserve level so that the districts are required to maintain that money absent some series of events that either they or we specify?
I don't think it's necessarily a problem with them not maintaining high enough reserves. I mean, we do have reserve requirements in place now that districts must maintain, but of course, they're, due to the recent economic troubles, a lot of them are, right down at those reserve levels now, but historically they've been quite a bit higher. And rather than hearing complaints that, reserves weren't high enough, we've heard complaints that they've had to hold too high. The reserves they've had to hold have been too big, too large.
Which sort of cuts against the need for the Prop 98 reserve.
Wow. Yeah, but to the extent that, that money that, if there was a little more stability in state funding, a little more certainty at the local level, if that money could instead be spent on instruction, I think everyone would benefit from that.
And I think, we have over 1,000 local education agencies statewide, and, the situation in each school district is going to be different. Some of them may be building up very large reserves because they're saving for a capital project. The one size fits all, I think probably makes us a little nervous at this juncture, and I think that's really why this relatively small portion of the 98 guarantee we would propose to hold at the state level, just to give some predictability that there wouldn't be these large swings down. Mainly is obviously what we're really trying to protect against, like we saw in the last couple of years, that school districts really, that was very, very disruptive, very volatile. And resulted in significant layoffs across the state, and uncertainty for these school districts. So it's really an effort to try and smooth. But I think I understand what you're saying, like a slightly different orientation of how the reserve would be built up.
Well, I certainly commend reserves, as I indicated at the beginning. I think I just ask that administration take another look at this particular piece of the reserve proposal to make sure that it's as consistent as we can possibly make it with our efforts in other education areas where we're trying to emphasize local control efforts. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Senator Roth. Senator Hancock, and then if we don't have any further questions, we'll move on to the LAO's presentation.
Thank you. I'm trying to make sure I can really understand this. We were saying that some of the goals for a reserve policy is that it should be easily understandable by the public, consider myself that, and that it should be flexible. So as I understand it, we already actually have a sort of existing operating reserve, right? It's the money that isn't spent the previous year. We use it for floods, fires, prison construction and contracts in the case of last year, some unanticipated expenditures. So we're talking about a reserve to eliminate the need for cuts, or cut a safety reserve. Okay. And I'm interested too in the interplay. Basically, we'd be replacing Prop 58 and ACA 4 with two new reserves, each based on half of the state income, assuming that Prop 98 means that 48% of our general fund will go to schools. And out of each piece of that division, we would take 6.5%. Yes? So is that a total of 13% total reserve, or 6.5 divided in half, or what?
Yeah. So we would not eliminate the special fund for economic uncertainties, which is our general reserve that you were talking
We would
about.
keep Prop 58.
So the proposal is to really build on Proposition 58, to the general reserve, and so the revenues that would go into the Prop 58 reserve would be those that are above 6.5%, the capital gains revenues above 6.5% of the state's general fund proceeds of tax after the Prop 98 set aside. So then the Prop 98 reserve, which I really think about as a reserve within the 98 guarantee, that would be a new reserve within the guarantee. After the calculation is made, the amount that's attributable to the 6.5% of capital gains revenues would also be deposited if, only if, there was enough money in the 98 guarantee going to schools to fully fund COLA and also enrollment growth. So that is really a condition that has to be occurring under all scenarios before any money would ever be put into the Prop 98 reserve. So yes, we would be replacing, so ACA 4 hasn't gone into effect yet because it hasn't gone before the voters yet, but we would be replacing the Prop 58 BSA with a slightly different version of the BSA and creating this new 98 reserve really within the 98 guarantee.
So but
I don't know if
Prop
that
58,
clarifies.
that reserve only requires a 3%.
That's right.
Okay, so are we talking 3%, 3.5%?
So we would substitute the 3% because the 3% is a requirement in both lean years and abundant years. And instead of doing that 3%, we would do the capital gains revenues above 6.5% of total general fund proceeds of tax.
Okay.
So we would substitute the amount that we're putting into the reserve.
And then you talked about the weaknesses in Prop 58, and I'm not exactly sure what those are. You talked about the fact that it could be suspended in a bad year as a weakness. It would seem to me in a bad year is when you want to suspend it. And are you saying that even in a bad year we couldn't?
I think the major weakness is really that it requires that 3% transfer in both lean years and abundant years. And then because of that inflexibility, that rigidity that exists, then there is more incentive to just suspend. Also, the current Prop 58 the governor can suspend that unilaterally. Our proposal would have the governor declare a budget emergency, but the legislature, through its budget deliberations, would take action to actually suspend that transfer to the reserve.
Okay, and that would be by a majority vote.
Prop 25
Yes.
requires that. Yeah.
Okay. And then would there be a definition of emergency? Would that be up to the governor?
That's actually one of the things we're working on. The fiscal emergency that was in Proposition 58, is not probably quite right because that talks about really mid-year emergencies is what it contemplates. But other than that, the fiscal emergency, budget emergency is not defined in the Constitution. We know what emergencies are, like the drought, like fires, floods.
Yeah.
But the fiscal emergency, really the first time that was discussed, in my knowledge, others may have more information, was in Proposition 58. But it's not quite right for the proposal that we're talking about.
Yeah, I would be concerned because if emergency is defined in a certain way, you would almost never meet the qualifications to get it out. If it's in fact budget stabilization that says you're going to have to impose cuts on basic systems that the people of the state rely on, that would be a very different kind of stabilization. So I'll be very interested in the wording of the bill, too, as Senator Nielsen said.
Thank you, Senator Hancock. Senator Corbett, and then Senator Jackson.
Yes, so if I have this right, the Prop 98 reserve would be within the Prop 98 guarantee. So money would be sent to the schools, but a certain amount would be restricted for the reserve or would be maintained in an account by the state.
Yeah, so a certain amount under our proposal would be held back at the state level in reserve and would not be allocated to schools in which in the year that it was earned is not the right word, but the minimum guarantee calculates a certain level that's due schools. And under our proposal, a certain amount would be held back, and that's only attributable to those spiking capital gains. And that money would only be held back if there was enough money going to schools in that year to ensure that enrollment growth and COLA were fully funded.
So what I'm not understanding is if that in fact allows us to meet our Prop 98 guarantee, how does that work within the current rules and requirements of Prop 98? In other words, we're meeting our requirement, however, we're restricting some of the funds. Maybe you can help me understand how that is allowed under the current
Yeah,
rules.
I mean, I think it's really the order of operations and in which we make these calculations, but the first calculation that would be made would always be, okay, what is the minimum guarantee based on the revenues that the state is projecting? And then there would be a supplemental calculation that would determine how much is really due to what are most certainly one-time spiking revenues that will not be it will be difficult to maintain that level of expenditures over the long term, and we're going to hold back a little of that money at the state level in the Prop 98 reserve account, and then those monies would be available for when revenues inevitably decline and the 98 guarantee declines in order to really stabilize spending for the schools. So it's sort of, and I don't want to get too much into all of the 98 jargon, but it's in some ways sort of a planned set aside for repaying maintenance factor in those down years when they really need it the most.
See the bill. I understand what's being said, but I'll have further questions later about whether that's something that I think is a good thing or not. I have to think about that a little bit. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Corbett. Senator Jackson.
Just a quick observation here. I know we're talking about percentages and all, but and that this is still in its very early stages, but I would like to strongly recommend that these decisions, as the bill gets written, are done in conjunction with the legislature. I'm kind of concerned that, from what I'm hearing, that there's a little bit too much discretion being put in the hands of whoever is the governor at the time, and I think that these are things that should come back to the legislature. And that whether it's Prop 98 or the other funding, we have to be very mindful that this is money that at some point is going to be highly sought after. So I think that we have to consider that factor as well. But at this point, I just want to urge that I didn't hear a whole lot about that the legislature will be involved in X, Y, and Z, and I don't think we should be relinquishing our responsibilities to this process.
Yeah, and I think that in our proposal versus Proposition 58, where the suspension of the transfer to the BSA can happen unilaterally by the governor, under our proposal, there would be a role for the legislature in both suspending transfers to the BSA and also in making withdrawals from the BSA. And that would be through our budget process.
Senator Corbett.
What is the guarantee that those funds will, in the Prop 98 account, the reserve account, what mechanism is there to guarantee that those funds will then be available? If they're part of the Prop 98 guarantee and they're set aside and they're restricted, how do we guarantee those funds will be available when they're needed, as they are part of the promised guarantee? They should be available.
So they would be absolutely set aside and would be available. They would not be available to fund other priorities on the budget There is, a nuance related to cash flow, but that is not dedicating those revenues in any way to other non-98 purposes. Because that's very important in the Prop 98 world. Those
Yes.
monies have to go for Prop 98 purposes.
Yes, that's what I'm concerned about.
Yeah.
But arguably, a time when they may need to be called upon because we're having a dip in the economy, right? Because that's what the reserve is there for. There'll be obviously other needs at that time for the state if it's a downturn time. So I'd just be concerned about knowing more about the whatever the mechanism is to assure those funds are available and whether that actually does meet the idea of Prop 98.
I think our concept is very much separate reserve from the BSA and not available for non-98 purposes.
Right, and just to add on to that, the concept is also to basically require those monies be allocated whenever there is insufficient growth in the guarantee to fund growth in COLA, or when the governor declares an emergency. So as Prop 98 requires monies to be allocated, when the guarantee, increases, we would have the same sort of requirement or envision the same sort of language for this reserve when 98 dips and there's money in the reserve, then there'd be a requirement that the money be allocated to schools at that time.
Thank you, colleagues. Ms. Bosler, thank you. Feel free to stay seated. We're going to ask the Legislative Analyst's Office to join us. Welcome, Mr. Sisney and Mr. Miller.
Jason Sisney, Legislative Analyst's Office. You have our handout, which is also on our website, for the budget reserve proposals. And on the first page is an outline of what we'll try to cover in a few minutes here, and look forward to your questions as well. I will mention that throughout the presentation, including the diagrams of the proposals at the back, with regard to the governor's proposal, we've been discussing these matters with the Department of Finance for the last several weeks, and so these reflect our understanding of the proposal as it is today, but when the language that's been discussed, when that's released, we will update this presentation and the flowcharts at the back if needed to reflect any change in the understanding based on the text of the plan. I'll turn it over to my colleague Ryan Miller to discuss an overview of some of the key issues related to budget reserves and the two proposals.
Mr. Miller.
Hi. Good afternoon, Ryan Miller, LAO. So we wanted to present a few key issues first. First of all, revenue volatility is a big challenge in our budget process. An important thing to understand about revenue volatility, however, is that capital gains are not the only source of revenue volatility. They are, in fact, one of the most volatile sources of income. But even in a good year, they only account for around 10% of general fund revenues. And so other sources of income, while perhaps less volatile, because they make up a larger share of the general fund, can actually result in larger variation in dollar terms. Proposition 98 has a significant impact on the ability to build a reserve. In some years, characterized by strong year-over-year revenue growth, Proposition 98 can require large increases to schools and community colleges. And this has been particularly true in recent years, in which the state has owed maintenance factor to schools. And that can make it harder to build reserves. And finally, the state's had a poor track record in setting aside money in good years. And the result of that is that more spending and tax relief commitments are built up in good years, and then when revenues underperform or decline sharply, the state has a larger budget shortfall that it must address through either spending cuts, tax increases, or other actions. So as was discussed earlier, the state has presently has two reserve accounts, the Special Fund for Economic Uncertainties and the Proposition 58 Budget Stabilization Account. I wanted to provide a very brief overview of 58 since it's already been discussed, and then we'll move into ACA 4. In Proposition 58, the current system, the governor by June 1st decides whether to suspend or reduce the annual 3% transfer to the BSA. And so in a year, say, where revenues are growing only very slowly, the governor could, by executive order, reduce the transfer to perhaps 1%, 2%, or some amount below 3%. In September, amounts are deposited to the fund until the ceiling, which is presently either 5% of general fund revenues or $8 billion. Right now it's $8 billion, which is around 7.5% of general fund revenues. And the state can access those funds by majority vote of the legislature. So to provide a quick overview of ACA 4, we think of ACA 4 as kind of having two different calculations. In the fall, an amount equal to 1.5% of general fund revenues is set aside and used for infrastructure purposes or paying down bond debt. At the same time, an amount equal to 1.5% of general fund revenues is placed in the rainy day fund. And these amounts, these transactions continue until the ACA 4 rainy day reserve reaches 10% of general fund revenues. Once that happens, they don't occur any longer. The ACA 4 fall deposits and the infrastructure amounts can be suspended or reduced when the measure authorizes a transfer out of the rainy day fund. And specifically, transfers out are permitted when resources available for a fiscal year are less than the prior year's spending adjusted for population and inflation. If that's the case, then the amount that's permitted to be withdrawn is either equal to that amount or 50% of the balance, whichever is less. The amount that can be withdrawn in a year is in a second year is actually also 50%, and then in a third consecutive year where that test is met, the account could be drained. Now the spring calculation, the Department of Finance calculates the lower of two amounts. On the one hand, it's resources available minus a 20-year regression. On the second hand, it's resources available minus last year's adjusted spending. The lower of those two amounts can only be used for specified purposes. First, you set aside money to make sure the 98 guarantee is met. Then you build reserves up to 10%, and then the measure has a variety of other defined purposes for which those amounts can be used.
Easily understood and explainable.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
No, you've done a good job.
Thank you. So ACA 4, broadly, I'll go a little bit bigger picture, continues the regular fall deposits that are intended by Proposition 58, and in addition aims to take some money off the table in the spring of good revenue years to further build that reserve or use it for other purposes. And since we've talked a lot about the governor's proposal, in the interest of time, I think we'll skip our summary, though Jason will discuss some implementation issues for both proposals. So to provide an overview of the key strengths of both proposals, both proposals try to encourage saving in good years. And by doing so, we would limit the amount of budget shortfalls that would occur in bad revenue years. Both measures create a bigger rainy day reserve. ACA 4 and the governor's measure both have a 10% sort of main reserve, non-98. And in addition to that, the governor's measure also has a Proposition 98 reserve, which would total around 6% of general fund revenues, the ceiling. Both aim to limit the use of the reserves in a first year of the downturn. The governor's measure would be 50% in the first year. ACA 4 would be 50% in the two consecutive first years where that test is met, and then you could drain it in the third year. And so with that, I'll turn it over to Jason for the next part of our presentation.